Hi there, and welcome to the SkillTorch Disrupt Podcast. I'm your host, Melica. Today, we're diving deep into the world of innovation and technology. Our topic for today is building consumer trust through transparent data practices. As the founder of SkillTorch, a recruitment company specializing in the AI, machine learning, ad tech, and gaming industries across the US and Europe, I've seen firsthand the importance of trust in these fields. Now, let's explore the topic with our special guest, Keith Petri. Keith Petri is the CEO of Lockr. Keith, I'm thrilled to have you here. But before we begin, can you please tell our audience a bit about yourself and the work that you do at Lockr?
Yeah, Melica, thank you so much for having me. I'm very excited to be here. As you already mentioned, I'm the CEO and founder of Lockr. Prior to founding Lockr, I spent well over a decade in the data management space. I spearheaded the first mobile DMP in around 2012. We were funded by Nielsen. We scaled the company and we later exited. I then served as the chief strategy officer for Screen6. We were acquired by Samba TV. Prior to acquisition, we were the largest private identity graph provider in the world. And what we did is we deduplicated data sets and we built cross-browser and cross-device connectivity for a number of ad tech platforms and some of the world's largest brands. I'm extremely passionate. I hope that comes through and is conveyed in this forum about data and identity. And I founded Lockr to give consumers a means to control those mechanisms. So in essence, you could say that my background and my drive to build trust and transparency around these data practices is really kind of fueled by my understanding of how the sausage is made. I fully support the open and free internet, but I also think that the consumer as the main stakeholder was forgotten, and they've more or less become an afterthought, if not a commodity. And we really need to try to shift that and embrace this opportunity.
Thanks for that overview, Keith. And I've kind of been, in your network for a few years. Obviously, your background's been in ad tech. I remember when you were at Samba, and we've kind of stayed in touch since. But I think what caught my attention to following you, and we'll post this after the podcast, is some of the infographics about some of the stuff that you're doing, all those cartoon ones. I don't know if some of your audience have seen them. It's absolutely hilarious. So I'm looking forward to us creating something really similar. Anyway, outside of the casual talk,
it is already in the works.
I love it. I can't wait to see it. But anyway, just talking about the privacy regulations, it's been shifting in favor of consumers. We're urging companies to sort of align their data practices with their consumers' best interest. With relation to marketing, considering your background within ad tech, and obviously, I'm exposed to that industry as well, how do you see marketing playing a role in sort of building a relationship with the trust of consumers?
Yeah, so it's often a topic that gets conflated in terms of how privacy regulations is directly impacting marketers and advertising and the ecosystem as a whole. But efforts like the GDPR and CCPA, the Australian Privacy Act, et cetera, all of these new regulations are built to protect the consumer and shift that data ownership and the control into the hands of the individual that creates the data versus the entity that tracks the data. And in certain geographies, companies now need explicit approval from the consumer to track their behavior. And that's why we see these, banners on every website to accept cookies. However, there's also a lot of questions as to whether these policies are really in the best interest of the consumer. Most consumers, they weren't really involved in the development of this regulation, which may come as a surprise. Often it's really creating a more disruptive experience for them. There's actually some significant research, multiple studies over the past, 5 to 7 years, that's shown the ineffectiveness of these communications, these cookie banners. So beyond the normal dark patterns, that is a whole separate topic. A dark pattern is any type of mechanism to control the UI or confuse the user about their optionality. Maybe some inconsistent elements in terms of buttons and colors and sizes, etc. So besides dark patterns, most users, and when they are experiencing this opt-out or consent mechanism, it's not interrupting their usage of the website, which means that they can be ignored. And mind you, I know that you're in Europe. It's a little bit different over there in terms of the overarching nature of these pop-ups.
Yeah.
But regardless, even when there's a ton of them, much more so on your side of the pond, nearly 90% of consumers and their experiences with these pop-up, there's no other option than a confirmation. So it's very annoying because they continue to be there until you confirm your willingness to be tracked. So through a lot of additional research, about 100,000 unique visitors were tested across this with various A/B testing. They found that only 0.1% of site visitors would freely choose to enable all cookie tracking,
Oh,
all
wow.
categories, all vendors, etc. And that's purely from the standpoint of testing different disclosures, different options, default on, default off. And it's really interesting when you look at it because counter to that, there are studies that show that most consumers aren't opposed to targeted advertising. Consumers actually care about transparency and understanding how their data is used and what that value exchange looks like. And
Definitely.
as a result of that, if you improve the user experience and you make it less disruptive and you empower them and trust them, I think that we can build a much more powerful and meaningful audience for each of these brands, whether it's a publisher, brand, retailer, etc.
Yeah, I mean, from the standpoint as a consumer, i.e., myself, sometimes you probably don't want to hear this. Sometimes I click, opt out, or sometimes I click accept. Just depends, how quick I want to sort of use the websites. But from the standpoint of companies where they're implementing this on their websites, are there sort of any alternative approaches that they can consider to sort of make that data management and consent more user friendly?
I mean, I don't have any great examples. I have a number of companies that are in market today that are pursuing this same, what I refer to sometimes as like a utopian future, where this does exist. So like imagine, like, let's take a step back. I agree with you. Data management for consumers has been a black box. And even with this new like regulation that we're seeing,
Yeah.
nothing sorted out yet, but consumers have very little insight into how their data is being used, and they have very little control over that usage unless like there's a clear way to adjust those settings. And unfortunately, that adjusting those settings is cumbersome and annoying and time consuming, and there's no return for that. So like if we can kind of envision this future, and again, I love talking about it as like this utopian future. Imagine a world where you could provision access to your data. And there are, as I mentioned, a number of companies working on this, and they share Lockr's long-term vision. What if you could like seamlessly port your Netflix viewership data into HBO, not HBO, but just Max, and get personalized recommendations? That's like a simple one. Or what, like, I don't know if anybody uses Yelp anymore. They certainly don't in Europe, or Foursquare or something. But like,
I used to
imagine
use
if
it a
you could look at
lot.
your like open I did too. Imagine if you could look at like your open table reservations, and you could seamlessly create a map of restaurants that match your preferences for some upcoming trip that you have. I mean, obviously, you talk a lot about AI on this platform. I mean, that is a perfect example. A family member of mine is going abroad. And they're going to an area of Europe where they haven't been before, and they were trying to plan out an itinerary and food preferences, but even OpenAI didn't have context of what that individual, my sister, what type of restaurants that she actually enjoys. And so if you could give it some of that context that it can learn from your own personal source data, there's a lot of opportunity there. So just in general, I think that this entire shift in data ownership and control and provisioning, there can be extreme benefits for the individual, and they will engage in it. But the brands, the companies, the enterprises need to also embrace this change.
Okay. So going back to, you talked about how some of the data is being managed in Europe, which is quite different from the US, especially when it comes to the cookie piece. Just for some of the listeners that are probably not aware of the differences, could you maybe outline like where, an organization like yourself or similar within the industry may have the challenge where it comes to sort of like data collection, data management in places within Europe versus the US, and what differences around that are?
Yeah, so I'll shift the answer purely for the sake of how things change so rapidly, and I'll make it more generic in a statement of
Yeah,
just
that would be really helpful.
challenges globally. And the main reason for that shift is that regardless of what geography you are active in, there is not an extremely large impact on how the infrastructure works, except for when it comes to how Apple and Google treat the operating system and browser. So it's like a big misconception that like cookies and their behavior has changed as a direct result of privacy regulation. And it's actually that Apple and Google have taken what I would call strategic moves as a result of these privacy regulations that then impact the average business. So since the announcement that Chrome would remove the third-party cookie, ad tech and MarTech industries, they've more or less been scrambling for an alternative. And mind you, it's been a long road to get here to where we are today. But now there's a tangible timeline in place, and it seems that Google's really committed to it. But this isn't just limited to cookies. You know, they will impact Chrome, and they do have the largest share of the browser market. But Apple's really the primary culprit here, and they're hiding behind the guise of privacy while they're building up their own ad tech walls internally. So they depreciated cookies in iOS and Safari a few years ago. They've depreciated device IDs in iOS 14 with app tracking transparency, and they've begun to manipulate IP addresses with Apple Private Relay. So, privacy regulation, they're not requiring these specific nuances to change, but Apple is doing it underneath these, publicly underneath, and blaming these changes in regulation, but it's really just for Apple's own gain. So there's been two different camps of alternatives that have really matured over the past few years. There's one that's like attempting to play whack-a-mole, for lack of a better term, and maintain the status quo with anonymous browsing. And that's one category. And then the other category is really leveraging PII to match across domains and across devices. And the vast majority of these tools, which are like the Trade Desk UID2 and LiveRamp and data clean rooms, they all primarily rely on email address as that piece of PII.
What's PII, by the way?
Personally identifiable information.
Okay, no, thanks for that. That makes sense then. So you mentioned that many companies are shifting to an email-centric first-party data policy due to the depreciation of cookies. Now, email itself does have its own privacy concerns. So how would you view this shift and the implications for consumer privacy?
So there are pros and cons associated with most, if not every solution generically, like not just in ad tech and martech, but in your day-to-day life and all of your decisions. But as for the cookie, which is what we're here to talk about, it really wasn't meant as a cross-domain tracking mechanism to begin with. It was a tool for local on-site functions. And then we started leveraging it as an industry in a way that it wasn't originally designed for. And what's remarkable about that is that it's actually quite similar to the question you're asking about email. And that change in the use case of email as an identifier versus just as a means of communication, that's actually what is causing the consumer reaction that the market's seeing today. So consumers now, they at least have the right with an email address versus a cookie to provide it to a vendor or to not provide it to a vendor. However, in a lot of these circumstances, they want to, or they might need to in case of an order confirmation or a subscription or a login, but they still don't want to be bombarded with email and spam thereafter. So like in terms of concerns and benefits in shifting towards email as an identifier, email is a vital aspect of a consumer's identity, and I'm the last person to question that. I mean, it's still shocking to me that the same identifier that an individual provides their bank, their email address, they use when signing up for some tabloid newsletter. I mean, like, we don't give, at least in the domestic US, our social security numbers out to just any businesses. So, like, it is a relatively persistent ID, and it has a utility of communication, but limited to when it's appropriate communication and welcomed communication. So consumers are mandated to give out their email to every website. I mean, inboxes are overflowing with spam and promotions. And arguably, like, email often contains additional PII, first name, last name, some other information can also be exposed. And they're exposing that to every company that they deal with. So out of either privacy concerns or the lack of willingness to have their, inboxes explode, many consumers are shifting to anonymous or temporary emails or proxy emails. We call all of these machine generated emails. And I think that that's going to continue to have this effect of continuous innovation and the need to change in terms of how the industry relies on email. Because if you're provided one email address on a retailer, abc@appleid.com, and you provide another email address on a publisher, 123@appleid.com, a lot of ad tech relies on the ability to match those two emails, and that is no longer possible.
I think we talked about this a few months ago around when you're going onto a certain website, Apple will actually suggest an alternative email address and a suggested password here. You mentioned that is something that you're doing with relation to what Lockr is trying to achieve for consumers and businesses. Can you tell us a bit more about that?
Yeah, so a few things to unpack there to dive into it. So first and foremost, yeah, I already walked through the storyline of Apple depreciating cookies, depreciating device IDs, and starting to manipulate IP addresses, which is an input that a lot of ad tech and MarTech vendors utilize. When they saw the industry shift towards relying on email as a point of identification, they were like, oh, we also need to interrupt those business processes as well. And they, again, branded that publicly as a privacy tool working on behalf of the individual. And I think that they have alternative motives here as well. Their product is not fully fledged. It doesn't have a proper UI. The controls are hidden within your settings, and it's very hard to utilize. And there's probably a few thousand posts every single week on Apple forums questioning why they can't figure out how to log into a to-do list application on their desktop when they have an account on their phone, or when they placed an order and the order confirmation wasn't sent to them, and they call up, the sunglass company and say, hey, I placed an order. My email address is john@aol.com. And they're like, we don't have an order from a john@aol.com. So there's a number of things there that are challenges that, yes, Lockr addresses. In terms of, why this is important to ad tech, and then we can kind of get into Lockr. Like, the internet is powered by advertising. A lot of the world is powered by advertising. I know that sounds crazy to talk about, and it's not like we're saving lives here, but
it
targeted
is.
Advertising is yeah, we are here to talk about it. So I guess this audience could appreciate it. But as the ability to serve targeted ads declines, we're going to see more and more paywalls. Publishers are going to struggle with their business models. We're seeing BuzzFeed News, Vice, a number of these companies publicly struggle. And so as marketing over the years has become more addressable as a result of cookies and device IDs and other identifiers, publishers shifted from monetizing their audiences as a whole, and now programmatically they're serving highly targeted advertising to generate premium revenues. And so without a targetable identifier moving forward available in that auction, the bid request, the value of that impression is dropping. And there are studies by Google that say that it's dropping by 64% when there's not a persistent targetable identifier available in that bid request. And so restricting access to information is very dangerous to society. And what I mean by that is, like, we don't want all of these paywalls. We want people to have access to information. We are used to subsidized products. It's very expensive to run a lot of the services that the internet provides consumers and are built into our everyday lives. And so we need to figure out how we can maintain the balance that we have created. I'm not saying it was the best solution. I'm not saying that, look, hindsight's 2020. We probably would have done things differently if we started over from scratch, but we're not starting over from scratch. It's not possible to start over from scratch. So I think that there's, a lot of things that have to be addressed there. So yeah, I could keep going, but I'll take a step back, I guess.
I was just going to add on to the whole the alternative email address thing. Just based on my experience when I'm browsing the web, I don't personally use it because my impression is, how am I going to remember all that user information when every single website I go on is different? Do you have any statistics or information as to how many people actually opt into signing up for alternative email addresses?
So first off, to your problem, I think that there will be opportunities with password managers that arise, and you're already seeing that happen with a number of these alternative tools to Apple Hide My Email and companies like 1Password and others, and supporting the mechanism to remember login information, since it's going to get more and more complicated. I personally don't think that that's the end all be all opportunity, and that's not how Lockr is building out their solution, which I'm happy to get into in a second. To your question about the adoption of what we refer to as machine generated emails, that's that's our bread and butter. That's what we do for these publishers, brands, and retailers that we work with, which is we analyze their database and we let them know, A, what percentage of their registration data is usable and not machine generated emails, and B, how fast is that growing? What's that adoption look like? And so across verticals, we're seeing different numbers, drastically different numbers actually. And based on how that business engages with their audience, we're also seeing different numbers. So it depends on if it's a paid subscription, if it's a registration wall, if it's a 7-day free trial of a product. There's all these nuances. But across the board, we're seeing upwards of 23% of registered users on websites being unaddressable because it's a single use machine generated email. And there's a huge nuance here. I want to be clear. If your email address is, let's use Keith at Gmail, and that's not actually my real email. I'm not that cool. But if it's Keith at Gmail, and that's what I use with my friends, that's what I use when I'm buying something and I really, really want that receipt and trust that brand, that's great. And that's a persistent email, and that can be used. And there's the comparable existence of maybe Keith Hockey at Hotmail, because I loved hockey as a kid and Hotmail was more popular back then. And let's say that has turned into my alternative. Yeah, exactly. It's turned into my alternative inbox that I use for the things that I really don't care that much about. But if I order something off of a great Instagram ad, they're way too good at targeting me. But like, if I order something, I'm going to use Keith Hockey at hotmail.com. Again, that's not my real email. And so if I'm using that everywhere, that's fine. Guess what? Trade Desk UID 2 will still match Keith Hockey at hotmail.com everywhere I go. LiveRamp will have a single record for me, Keith Hockey at hotmail.com, across multiple sites, assuming that I'm using that on publisher sites and on brands and retailer websites as well. But that's not what we're combating here. What we're combating is the growth of machine-generated emails, where Keith shows up to a website, Nike, and instead of typing in Keith at Gmail, instead of typing in Keith Hockey at hotmail.com, I click a button and it generates an enormously long, completely unique string of letters and numbers at some random domain.com that will never be matchable, never be usable, and is really cumbersome for the user, to be candid with you. So it's not an easy product to use. Consumers are using it more and more and getting confused and having negative brand experiences, and it's breaking the entire balance and ability for different companies to communicate with one another.
Okay. No, that's really interesting insight. And yeah, I just learned a couple of things there that I didn't know about in terms of using alternative email IDs there. So thanks for sharing that overview. So with regards to what Lockr does in terms of providing an innovative solution with regards to the realm of data control and privacy, talking about going into your business and what you're doing and what your mission is, what you're trying to achieve. Tell us a bit more about how you're sort of helping consumers control their digital identity even further and in a lot more detail, but while also benefiting other companies and businesses.
Yeah, I think it's that careful balance that is honestly vital for any one of these products, including any of our competitors, to be successful. I think that you need to think of all of the stakeholders involved. And so we knew from the start that we wanted to represent consumers in this identity discussion, but we also knew that we wanted to do so in a way that would sustain the economics of the open and free web. So Lockr Mail, it's our primary consumer tool in the market today, and it gives consumers a publicly facing email to use securely across the web. So any emails sent to Keith at Lockr Mail are delivered, or you could use the word forwarded, to my pre-existing inbox. And I can choose my personal inbox, my work inbox, etc. And so from there, I can also choose if I want to allow or block or filter those emails from each individual company. So the product, meaning Lockr Mail, has all of these tools for control as well, including like grouping delivery based off of category or time of day. We also have a great Chrome extension, and we're investing heavily in improving that Chrome extension and making it an integral part of the browser experience for the user. So in terms of where Lockr Mail is today, we're positioned as an email productivity tool, but our plans of features and offers for that consumer go well beyond. And as you begin to use the product, you'll see that more and more so in terms of controlling email verification emails or controlling pop-ups that happen within your browser. We just did a full integration with global privacy control, which enables an individual to flag their browser behavior as opting out of being tracked by certain websites that respect that signal. So like we want to start with an immediate value for the consumer that helps them in a challenge that they have today. If you came out with a product that simply enabled my mother to control her consent across all of her relationships with companies, she loves me, she fully supports Lockr, and she would still say, why do I need that? So people are not at the point, at least here in the domestic US, maybe in the EU, it's a little bit more mature, where they're like, we need a solution to just consent, just privacy. That's not that's not something that I like to discuss as my wedding test. If you show up with a partner and you're paired with 6 random people at a wedding, you're not going to bring up this amazing privacy tool that you just used last week, but you will bring up Lockr Mail. So that's the consumer side. On the B2B side, we're partnering with publishers and brands to educate them about the rise of machine-generated emails. So these anonymous temporary email services like Apple Hide My Email that we're talking about. And we're encouraging these publishers and brands to support the usage of Lockr Mail as a better alternative. So as part of our publisher APIs, we have a full suite of them. We also offer email verification, so real-time verification of is an email going to be deliverable? Is an email going to be utilized effectively to increase the CPMs on my page? Will this email increase my match rates with Snowflake, Habu, InfoSum, etc.? We also offer a single sign-on solution, which is a huge benefit for consumers looking for more seamless browsing. And within our SSO, we have a built-in consent mechanism, which allows that individual to either consent or not when they're signing up to a website to share their real identity or keep it within their own walls, within their locker. And you can do this at a global level across all publishers that we work with, or you can do this on an individual level and have that type of granular control. And so we're very excited about it. We think that it can bring a lot of clarity to this space, and it can actually have value in addition to just utility within this new realm of privacy that we're dealing with.
Yeah, thanks for that overview. And I agree. I mean, even for myself, before I'm even sending out emails to companies, it's so important to sort of verify a lot of the email addresses. Even to this day, I still get emails back saying undelivered or delayed or something like that. So I still feel like there's a lot more work that needs to be done. But it's great that, you're focused on really tackling that, but with the additional element of data privacy and innovation around that. Going back on to
those bounce rates that
I think it's just a short delay there. Sorry,
I was just going to interject. We typically don't talk about this in general because it's not an ad tech topic, but like those bounce rates are a huge challenge for these websites. So not just your business, but think of an enormous publisher. If they have 1 million email addresses of people that registered, but 20% of those are machine generated, some machine generated emails don't bounce, others do. There's also issues with spelling. We recently found that it was well over 2% of registrations across a large number of publishers that we're working with were simply misspelling of gmail.com, of the user's email address. And so verifying an email at the point of sign up can actually help you engage that user more effectively, minimizing your bounce rates, which are very important, because if you have 200,000 of your users that are bouncing and you're able to not send those emails originally, if your IP address through your email service provider is flagged as having a high bounce rate, your deliverability and the way that your emails are treated to the 800,000 real emails is actually going to negatively impact your business and your brand in front of those real users as well. So sorry, you brought up the point, not me.
No, and I'm happy you answered it. So thanks for that. I was just going to ask you, just again, specifically on your business, because I'm sure you'd love to talk about this all day long. But what's I'd be interested, and I'm sure some of our listeners are as well. What's next for Lockr? You know, what are kind of your growth trajectory plans for the next few months, or maybe in the next couple of years? Or is that top secret?
I mean, it's definitely not top secret. We have some announcements that will likely even be out before we publish this podcast. But in general, there's a lot of work to be done on the consumer side, and there's continuous work to be done in terms of partnerships and expanding the availability of Lockr across publishers, brands, and retailers. And the identity ecosystem is candidly enormous. Like, it's not just what I was used to with my background at Screen 6 in terms of ad tech identity. There's authentication providers. There's it's across the board. And so what we've come to realize on the B2B side of our business, which we call Identity Lockr, we need to make it easier to work with Lockr, but we also need to make it easier to work with other vendors as well that complement what we're doing, and that may be there could be seamless ways to integrate those technologies on behalf of our customers. When you go into, and this is for any business, if you go into any business and they have a list of 20 integrations that they want to accomplish, there's a prioritization. And unfortunately, there is a number of partnerships that cannot be pursued simply from the standpoint of not having enough resources to execute appropriately upon all of them. And so there's prioritization, and we've all been in those meetings where you have a great rapport with a, BD or data integrations person or sales engineer, or it doesn't matter what. And you're like, unfortunately, you're not prioritized for us right now. Let's talk next quarter. And I think that what's vital is that that's not just a Lockr thing. That's not just something that happened with Screen 6 and my prior companies, but that is across the board. And so I think that if we take advantage of how systems can interact with one another, there are ways that you can do a single integration that unlocks multiple opportunities. And we can do that with other authentication providers, as well as we can do that with some of the other downstream or upstream identity solutions as well. And I think that that can create a healthier ecosystem, an easier integration with publishers, brands, and retailers. And it can also drive adoption on the consumer side as well for us. So there's a lot going on. I mean, just a little, I guess, celebration of how far we've come. It's like also kind of hard to think about this as a journey that has occurred when there's already like so much stuff in the future mapped out. Like there's so much more coming in the future versus behind us. And so a major milestone, I mean, we literally just hit it yesterday, but like while I was prepping for this, we processed for the first time over 100,000 emails in a single day. Like, to fathom that like our team has produced a product that touches like tens of thousands of people and is instrumental to like their day-to-day lives, like that's so cool to like think about. And there's billions of emails every day, so there's more opportunity out there.
Fantastic. Well, I look forward to hearing more about the future announcements. So I'll be checking my LinkedIn feed, or speaking with you directly to find out what's going on. But I'm sure we're all going to see like what you have to say, potentially at Cannes or wherever that may be. Is there anything else that you wanted to sort of add on this podcast before we kind of wrap things up?
No, I think that overarching, we've touched on most of the points that I spend, every 30 minutes of my day doing a pitch over and over and over. But consumers would really rather see a targeted ad rather than a completely irrelevant one. I mean, we
Mm.
haven't actually said that on this call, but that's what we've been dancing around. Uh, but with that being said, they also don't want their data to be sold or used in a way where they have like little to no visibility. And so maintaining and respecting this relationship between consumers and publishers and advertisers, there is an opportunity to take these new regulations and benefit from them, not just be scared of them and play whack-a-mole as a result. And so these new identity solutions that are in the market, they're making assumptions about what is important to consumers, while ultimately they're still trying to preserve the economies, the economics of what we've been used to as an industry historically. But consumers are not actually aligned with how they're approaching it. So we should, instead of that, really trust the consumer to partake in these everyday transactions. I mean, we're all consumers ourselves. Like, how do we want to be treated? And I think that that can really help shape what initiatives we put forward, protocols that we push and standardize, and integrations that we work with. I mean, there's a lot more we can say on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one key question that I think would be useful to ask before we wrap things up. I mean, how can businesses advertise in the way that is respectful for consumers' privacy preferences when they are opting out or opting in? How can they follow that through?
Unfortunately, it's not really the advertiser's fault. I mean, let's go back to that lovely wedding example. If somebody asks me at a wedding, oh my God, I saw a Nike ad, I clicked on it, and I bought the shoes, and I still keep seeing the Nike ad, that's not Nike's fault. That's the platform and infrastructure's fault. I mean, there's multiple players involved there. There's issues with passing that data in real time to flag that John converted. Let's stop targeting him with the same ad. I mean, you can upsell John. Maybe he bought golf shoes and you want to sell him golf clubs. But like, this is about the platforms, of which most of them will be at Cannes, and they need to solve it. And so it's, I love the question. And I do think that there's some responsibility for the brand, but the brand is not building the infrastructure or the technology to facilitate that. Trust me, the person at the brand does not want to be wasting their spend continuing to target John, or wasting their spend targeting John when John would rather raise his hand and be like, I hate Nike golf equipment. Stop targeting me with that. And that's very much where Lockr is heading.
Okay, well, I look forward to the developments and what you have in store, as I mentioned to the announcement. So, it's been a really thought-provoking conversation. You've highlighted the importance of trust, privacy, and the evolving digital landscape, and where Lockr fits in, and what the future prospects and how it can benefit businesses. So, thank you so much, Keith, for sharing your insights and expertise with us today. And then thank you to the audience for joining us on this episode of this SkillTorch Disrupt podcast. Keith, I'm really excited to see that graphic that your graphic friend is going to create for us. So yeah, I'm really excited to post this along with this podcast.
I appreciate you having me, and I'm looking forward to promoting it as well.
Yeah, like